One other thing that's remiss of me, it's like, a wedding speech. Yesterday, I didn't acknowledge, firstly, Jackie Crow, who's really instrumental in the Equally Well movement and getting that started, but also Beverly Raphael. And Beverly Raphael was partly responsible for me for coming to New South Wales in more ways than one. She interviewed me when I became an Executive Director of Mental Health Services, but also her 2000 monograph on promotion, prevention and early intervention that she wrote. So it was Aaron Groves whispered in my ear, said, well, I didn't realise Beverly was behind that, but she's certainly behind this. I also acknowledged Rod McKay, who wasn't here yesterday, for his work, decades ago that Rod referred to. Now, this is the thing. The issue here is a lot of this stuff is preventable, and we've talked a little bit about the physical illness and the physical side, but I want to open this up a little bit more in terms of starting to think about a model of promotion and prevention. And we've talked about all the risk factors. That's in the Equally Well consensus statement. Sorry for the people taking photos for Twitter. But, across all of these, the 12 to 15% of people with mental illness, more of those people die than the entire rest of the 85% early of physical illness. We know this. It's an issue and it's a human rights issue. But even more so, for certain if you're rural, but if you're not participating, if you're not in any paid employment, this is something I think, Catherine, about inclusivity and community participation. More for every one person who dies of suicide, early of suicide, of course, 10 die early of cardiovascular disease, cancer, or respiratory disease. And it's not as shocking, but it's just as tragic. These people also have families, and they're dying 20 or 30 years earlier. And normally, that's preceded by years or decades of poor physical health and functional disability. So it's really important for us to think about how we can get in early, promote, prevent, and get a bit of a model of that. We've talked a little bit about this already, and the importance of improving physical health actually is now becoming one of the go-to recommendations for improving mental health. So a lot of the recommendations say, if you want to improve someone's mental health, go and focus on their physical health because you're likely to have the best effectiveness. Likewise with suicide assessment, it's almost standard. You do a suicide risk assessment, the biggest risk is early death from physical illness. You should be doing physical health risk assessment. We've talked about diagnostic shadowing. Equally Well consensus statement. The second element is effective early intervention, promotion and prevention. What does this mean? It hasn't been unpacked, and I hope that we can do this a little bit today. We've talked about that too, that there's a bit of a transition here. So there's a period here where comorbidity is really low, and then a bit later it comes really high. What's happening in the middle, and how can we intervene early? Or how can we intervene, and I'll explain what I mean early, through the entire lifespan. Early doesn't mean young, necessarily, it means early, and that's at any stage. It can be at 85 years of age or at 5 years of age, and that's where I'm going to go with you, Catherine, in terms of should it be 12 years of age? Well, let's talk some more about that, because I think it's a great conversation, by the way, and thank you for your presentation. This was the model, and I think Beverly Raphael referred to this in 2000, monograph on promotion prevention. And you intervene across a spectrum of illness for mental health promotion prevention. It's a Mrazak and Haggerty model that a lot of you are familiar with. It's okay, but it's just part of the spectrum. But there are some issues with that. It starts with prevention, moves into early intervention, and then on to treatment. And this is the model, universal through to selective, through to long-term care. And that's a model that's been out there since the late 80s, I think early 90s, 1990 I think the reference is. But that overlooked the social determinants. If we're thinking about early intervention and prevention, what are the social determinants of health and well-being and the biological antecedents and social issues and social equality, which Catherine was talking about? It doesn't help us too much in terms of what do we do at all different levels as a clinician, as a social policy person, as a social equity campaigner. What do we do about this? And it doesn't inform it across a spectrum of care from universal promotion through to people who have severe and enduring mental illness across that spectrum of health and ill health. The other thing is the language, and it's been referred to. Well, what do we mean by primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention? And how does that work with early intervention and prevention and all of that? So really what we did in my time as chair of the New South Wales Promotion, Prevention and Early Intervention Committee is try and nut this out and make something that was usable and understandable. So we looked to sort of develop some plain language definitions, and we had this table, I won't go into too much before, but we actually put it in action language: actions to promote mental health and well-being, actions to prevent the onset of illness, actions to intervene early to reduce the duration and severity, and this is in mental health, that was a mental health committee at the time, actions to reduce the ongoing impact of mental ill health. Now if you're like me, that was when it was a mental health committee, but I've evolved since then. That was about 2005 to 2010. Yeah, my watch is going too, but that's all right. We'll just turn that one off. Sorry, the phone's going off. Luckily, it's on silent. But for us, we now to think about, well, what about today, about physical health? So let's talk about this model a little bit. So this was the model that we came up with. So in terms of what is primary prevention, well, primary prevention is essentially the actions that was New South Wales policy. Now, firstly, there's actions to promote health. The very first thing we should be doing is actions to promote health, and that's where I'm going to invite you to come in, Catherine, a little bit later, to think about how we promote health in all communities and some of the actions we can do this society-wide to promote health. And really anyone who was sort of following that, I think it's sort of pretty straightforward. Then there's actions of primary prevention, which is the actions to provoke the onset. There's two categories there. It's a whole of community, but also there's groups at high risk. Catherine's identified that, the LGBTI plus are a group that's high risk. So are people who have suffered trauma. So are people who are homeless. So are people of low SES. So what are the actions we've already identified the high risk. So what are the actions that we can get in primary prevention? Secondary prevention is the same as early intervention in the nomenclature. So what are some things we can do who are at high risk, high identified risk, but also early signs, the signs of early poor well-being and mental ill health are there, and also people who are experiencing their early first episode, and that's where the BOND group, the Bondi group, are doing with the early intervention for young people with psychosis, etc. And then there's tertiary prevention, which is actions to reduce the impact of mental health. I looked at this model and thought, this is a mental health model, but we can really apply this to physical health, can't we? We can really just change this to this. Actions to prevent the onset of physical ill health. When we think of people who are at risk of mental illness or have mental illness, those sorts of actions. Actions to reduce the duration and severity of physical ill health. Actions to lower the impact of ongoing ill health. So when Indigo was talking before in terms of her early medication, etc. There were actions there that could have happened to stop her putting on those 50 kilograms. There was actions to sort of keep her fit, and Simon talking about actions about keeping people physically fit. And then we've got the issue of people that enduring an ongoing mental illness, and Simon was talking about that as well. So luckily for you, I'm going to stop talking in a sec. So this is sort of, when we start to think about this in physical health, this is a bit of a framework we can think about in terms of using that language for physical health. But I'm now going to throw to you in terms of, and this is in terms of what Nimai was talking about, in terms of an example of a way that you can conceptualise this, because the next question is, what do we do? The question for Equally Well is, what are you going to do differently? You do what you can, where you can, when you can. And for each person that's different. We all have a different role. I encourage you to get the slides and say, for Equally Well, I am going to do this. For me, I'm going to put together a submission to the Productivity Commission about we really need to address this issue. But for everyone, it's a different action you can take. So what are the actions that you can take? Well, hopefully we've got the roving mic here. So So there's physical health actions. What are some of the actions that we could take to promote health and well-being? What are some of the domains that we could look at? Nehemiah used the 28 domains out of the World Health Statement for physical health. That's a little bit complicated, I think. But what would be some of the domains, and I'm going to ask for people to suggest this now, what would be some domains where you say, this is what we could be doing now to promote physical health in terms of mental health and physical health promotion? Kim? Oh, 5 minutes. Rod?
I'll start by being controversial. If you go back a slide, oh sorry, 2 slides, is it? No, your lovely picture. Surely, if we really want to get to grips with this, that should just say actions to promote health. It should be physical health, and we should get away from the physical and the mental, because one of the great blocks is people still do see their primary role in physical or mental, and maybe that's the starting place. And if you want to take an example of where that's working, if you want to think about something that we think we can't prevent and is debated whether it's mental illness, it's dementia. And yet we now know good data from the UK, and there's some service data just published in Australia that's supportive but not as strong, that says we actually probably have reduced the population rate of dementia, and it's probably through the physical health, improved physical health of the community.
It's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because then there's the whole issue of well-being. And is well-being more than just health? So what do you call your spirituality, your connection to the land, your connection to your country, your connection to your culture, connection to your gender identity? Is that health or is that well-being?
No, definitely health and well-being. I wasn't saying take the well-being out, but whether it should all be, though, about health and well-being, you shouldn't have physical or mental.
Take the physical out?
Take the physical out.
Okay, yeah.
So it's just health and well-being.
And well-being. Yeah, no, great. We'll move back forward slides. Thanks, Rod. I mean, that's a great point. And it does raise the other point of talking just about physical health, and I think that was your point too, Catherine, just focusing just on physical health and mental health as conditions is not enough. I think the foundations are in an inclusive culture. And when you were talking about, 12 might be the age, and I think you alluded to it as well, I was thinking, well, maybe it's 3 or 4. I mean, setting those templates of, well, is it okay to have 2 mums and 2 dads? And is that just another thing? It's another form of family which is equally okay, and it's not even commented on. That's at 2, 3 and 4 is when that sort of mental template starts, and that social inclusivity. Is it okay to be from a different race or a culture? Yes, it is. So it's all of that. It's the not okayness, I think, and it's such a great presentation, that is the seeds of poor mental health and that social exclusion. I'm not an accepted part of this community. So that's the part of being, well, that I'm connected and I'm valued and I'm equal. And it's such an important part, and I'm so pleased that we had the discussion, and I think Rod and I think we came up with the term equally well ourselves, independently to the New Zealanders, but the New Zealanders got to us 2 years before us, but there might have been some seed there. But the equal stuff is really important in this. I think for the physical health, and because there's been no hands up, so I've got to sort of fill the gap. And so if you don't talk, I'll fill the gap. I think it's pretty clear, in terms of, prevention of cancers, prevention of cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease and diabetes. They're the sorts of things that you'd be looking, how do I prevent that straight away? And then when there's early signs and the risk, how do I get in to prevent the risk? When there's the first signs, how do I get in with interventions to minimise that? So in terms of those actions to prevent the onset of diabetes or cardiovascular disease or respiratory disease, which are the big early killers, I think that's pretty clear, and we've got methodologies for that. So I think the challenge is for people and the clinicians to work up a bit of a model, but to think about this. This is probably one of the most important things you can do. For every 2 people you convince or to stop smoking, you will save one of their lives. You will give one of them 20 years of additional life. That is a great gift. If you said to someone, I've just given you another 20 years, and someone did that to you, you'd say, that is an amazing gift. So for every 2 people you convince to stop smoking, you will gift one of them 20 years. And it's the same for another number of the other risk factors in terms of physical health. It's so important to intervene early, promote and prevent, because you are giving people a gift of years of life and health. What about the social and environmental factors? Rod and then Stephen.
I think if there's something fundamentally we can do which is done better at the start and the end of the lifespan, but something goes drastically wrong in the middle, is actually regular contact with your GP. And think about diabetes, the evidence is building and building about the fact that early joint consideration of anxiety, depression and diabetes risk factors has got this wonderful cycle of improvement. The only way we're going to do that is if we are from within the health system, within the consumer movement. We are, the point is towards in Australia where we have got the GP at a crucial point to really be using that.
Thanks, Rod. Stephen, did you have your hand up? Yep. And then I might ask Catherine a question I noticed in terms of social and environmental factors. What would be areas that you would recommend that in the mental health field we should be thinking about and focusing on?
I was just going to comment on the great presentations and also just on the area of polypharmacy and also, I guess, my concern of lack of algorithms for especially psychiatrists in the management of metabolic conditions. It's often, especially in rural communities, that's where I'm part of, it's such a difficulty to access an endocrinologist on site. What's being done to get that care immediately to that patient is something that I'm pointing to.
The algorithms are there. They're just going to be on the desk. The tools are there, but they need to actually use them.
Yeah, that's one point too. And also, I guess, when do you start lipid lowering therapy, for example? When do you cut off that? Not just for a patient with hypercholesterolemia, but for a patient with risk factors of, especially with polypharmacy in the background. That's probably what I was trying to say.
Catherine, did you have I'm just conscious of the time, we've got 2 minutes, is that right, Kim? 1 minute. Catherine, did you have any comments or suggestions around that social environmental factors that you wanted to add?
I can say something very quickly. Well, I think that in the kind of sense about the early intervention, I suppose that's what I'm trying to say about with the school situations, that if you start very early in life and then people don't develop a sense of themselves and it rooted inside themselves as being something wrong, so they then have that narrative of a struggle to come to terms with who they are, etc., etc. I think in the public domain, not having debates about people's rights to exist would have a positive impact. I do agree with you though about that midlife thing. My work is around LGBT kind of well-being, is that actually often there are people who come out midlife who haven't come out early, and there isn't much done about that because most of the resources are being pushed into young people and young people's mental health with that kind of assumption that if you can tackle something early, then they will have a longer life, and then you get this sense of, well, what happens if you're in your 30s or in your 40s, and the reason you didn't come out was because of shame, or it may be people's narratives might be about being very committed to religious communities and being worried about what the impact that would have. So then there isn't much going on to pick those people up, and I suppose there's maybe a history within psychology, which would go back to Freud, which is basically there's no point bothering once you're past 40 because there isn't any kind of change. So they might be wanting to sort of tackle some of that kind of element in the sort of midlife issue.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. And I think I encourage people to think across your domains, at every level that you can go. So, for example, some of the social environmental factors I was thinking about is, violence. Are they in a safe environment, or are they going back to a domestically violent situation? Safety. just physical safety of the community, and certainly around areas where I was working with Kenya, etc., there was difficulties with that. Homelessness, social inclusion, social participation. These are the sorts of things we should be asking and taking the point before, looking positively and looking at the positive aspects to say, well, what are your life goals, etc. And so trying to address some of those things. So what do we do? Depends at whatever level you work. But even that constellation model, every time someone says racist or exclusionary, you say, that's not okay. Every time someone picks on someone, bullies on someone, you, as a bystander, says, that's not okay, and stick up for them. That enhances everybody's well-being. It's a small thing, but it's changing the universe. But we've got people here at other levels who can advocate across your services and change service practice, advocate politically, advocate socially. And so everything we do makes a difference. And so we can promote, prevent, and have early intervention across all of those different domains for people, with a mental illness to prevent the poor physical health outcomes that we've got. So I'd encourage you when you go out there to say, think about this in terms of the action, what you're going to do on Monday to improve the physical health. And across all of these domains, there's so many opportunities that if you can't think of one, I can help you with that. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Russell. Not only has leadership come out through the course of this this symposium, the other thing that I've noticed that's come out of this is a need and a sense for people to belong in our community, and that goes to all of the groups that we're talking about our older people, talking about our different populations, talking about people with mental illness, people with physical health conditions, homelessness. One of the biggest things that impacts on people's mental health and well-being is a sense that they don't belong. And we even talked about that yesterday in terms of people that were smoking, feeling that they don't belong in a community now because they smoke, or that the groups around them don't smoke. So I think this whole sense of us needing to belong, and we should all want to belong, and we all need to belong for our health and well-being, has been really important conversation, I think, throughout the whole of this symposium. So can I thank all of our speakers once again, and enjoy your lunch.